Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 2316 or Modern World History. So, our topic for this week is the expansion of Afro-Eurasian empires. And really the purpose of throwing this lecture out there and talking about this week is to get us thinking beyond Europe. World history has largely been dominated between 1500 and 1800 with the expansion of European empires. But with this being a world history class, it behooves us to look beyond just Europe and their expansion to the Americas and look at what's going on in a global process, and that is empire building and contested growth. Between 1500 and 1800, European empires are growing, Asian empires are growing, and African empires are growing, all in response to increasing globalism. So ultimately what we're going to be looking at this week is the emergence of the Oyo Empire in Africa, the Mughal Empire in India, and then we also look at some of the bases of colonialism and imperialism between Europe and the Americas. So, with this week's video lecture, I'm going to focus heavily on the Mughals and the Oyo and not so much on the establishment of Western or European colonies. The colonies in the Americas, everything's happening at a bit of a different time. They're going to be seeking independence a lot earlier than the other colonies around the globe because they're being colonized earlier. So really I'm going to leave you to work through the European section of the lecture through the PowerPoint slide and just talk today about the Oyo and the Mughal Empire. So, looking at the Mughal Empire, they, like every other empire we're looking at this week, they're growing at the cost of other people. That's what colonialism is all about. It's establishing a formal political control over another region so that you can utilize and access that region's resources. It's really to exploit an area and a people's labor and resources for the benefit of a foreign government. And so when we look at the Mughals, the foundation of the empire is coming on the back of a man named Babur. In the 1500s, early 1500s, Babur had established a kingdom for himself in what today we would call Kabul, Afghanistan. Now it's important to sort of look at the background of the Mughals because they're going to claim leadership based on a couple of different sort of influences. Obviously they're going to be spreading Islam around the Indian subcontinent, and that's one of the ways that they claim authority in the territory is by spreading a true religious practice to a bunch of non-believers. That's one way they justify their expansion there. Now, another issue that we're going to deal with here is that Babur ties his legitimacy back through what we call the Timurid dynasty. The Timurid dynasty, also sometimes called the Tamerlane dynasty if you're reading through European documents, because Timur was also called Tamerlane by the Europeans. But he was one of the children that, or one of the people who married Genghis Khan's children. So in a lot of ways, when Babur talks about his descendancy coming by way of Tamerlane or Timur, he's talking about how he is tied to a ruling family of Asia in general. The Khans and the Khanates that are established after the role of Genghis Khan are going to have a lot of authority and sort of historical authority around Asian territories. So it's important that he's calling back on that. He's seeing himself as being tied back to this great warlord Genghis Khan. Now, Babur is going to use a person who is close to the ruling dynasty of the Lodi state. The Lodi dynasty is established in the area around Delhi in what is India. And there was somebody within the ruling sort of class of the Lodi dynasty that was dissatisfied with their position. So they're going to break away and start feeding information to Babur so that essentially he can go in and raid the Lodi dynasty of Delhi. And that's going to happen in the Battle of Panipat in 1526. Now, this is going to be a critical battle for two reasons. Number one, it is really the foundation of the Mughal Empire in India. We start looking at 1526 as a start date for this empire. But also, this is the first battle in the Indian subcontinent that will ever use gunpowder, so that we're seeing another first here in world history. Now, ultimately, Babur is going to win the Battle of Panipat in 1526 and found the Mughal dynasty, and from there he's going to start to try to expand his power all around northwest India, and in the area that today we call the Punjab. So that is how the Mughals will become established in the Indian subcontinent. And what's really interesting to watch, again, we talk about this process of colonialism being contested. And what we're seeing here is that the early and later expansion coming on the back of the Mughals empire, it's going to be a centralized state with a core religious identity and a core ethnic identity that forms the ruling class here in the Mughal dynasty. All of the rulers of the Mughals will be Muslim, and they're going to use that religious hegemony to go in and create a centralized state. Within Islam, they have largely the same political structures that are found in the Western world. And so what's happening here is that the establishment of the Mughal dynasty is going to create a centralized top-down hierarchy. There's one single ruler with a number of people underneath him in the ruling class, and they're administrators, and they all have their own jobs. But basically, it's a top-down hierarchical centralized society. And so they have a lot of ties back to what we would call the Middle East today, areas in Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way stretching even as far as the Ottoman Empire over into Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. But ultimately, there will be, in the 17th century, a series of expansive campaigns, and Akbar will also be able to solidify the Mughals' hold over central India. And he's doing this largely with divide and conquer tactics. What he does is the people who are inhabiting this area before the Mughals showed up are various rajas of the Hindu religion. So you have independent small rulers. These are decentralized states. You can't have all of the Hindu classes of India will never come together as one giant Hindu force to fight back against the Islamic force of the Mughals. So what Akbar is going to do is go to one Hindu Raj and say, look, you want to be partnered up with the guy who's in charge here, right? The strong person, the person who has a strong centralized state. Once he gets a promise of cooperation from one Raj, he's going to use the power of that state to go conquer another Raj in a neighboring territory. So once he's done conquering one area by partnering up with a neighbor, he's going to turn around and conquer the neighbor he just partnered up with. This is what we call divide and conquer tactics. It happens with the Europeans in the Americas. The Oyo state is going to use it when they're growing in West Africa, and the Mughals are using it here in India as well. So the classical period of the Mughal dynasty is going to leave us with a lot of remnants that we're familiar with today. And a lot of the culture of northern India is going to be built out during the classic period of the Mughal dynasty. And that period is considered to be the rules of Akbar, Jahangir, his son, and then his grandson, Shah Jahan. And during this time period, the Mughals are able to grow by leaps and bounds. They firmly plant themselves in northwest and northern central India, and then under Jahangir, they're going to go down and move into what we call the Deccan. The Deccan is the southern plateau of India, and it's where the vast majority of the forested areas are, and where most of the Hindu people and Sikh people are living. So during the classic period of the Mughals, their policies towards religion is very, very much tolerate other things existing within our kingdoms. They don't want to bring on the ire of the Hindu classes and the Sikh classes that they're ruling over. They want to work in cooperation with these folks. So they allow them to continue practicing their religion pretty much unabated. So we see during the classical period, this period of religious harmony. And as a result of that religious harmony, there's strong economic and cultural growth. And when I'm talking about cultural growth, I'm talking about architecture and physical landmarks that are still dotting the landscape of northern India today. It's during this period that we see the construction of the Persian Gardens in Delhi, of the Taj Mahal, of Agra Fort, all these major landmarks of India that people to this day are going by the millions to see, were built during the classical period of Mughal rule in India, mostly under Jahangir and Shah Jahan. In fact, it's Shah Jahan builds the Taj Mahal as a mausoleum to his wife. And so that's the classical period of the Mughal dynasty. That's when they're expanding, they're growing. More people want to become part of the Mughal dynasty because it's going to facilitate trade and economics in the area. But we're going to see that Shah Jahan will be overthrown by his son Aurangzeb, and he will destroy that policy of religious tolerance. And from the late 1700s going into the early 1800s, we see a slow and steady decline of the Mughal state. you start to see more revolutions from within the state. People who are upset with the new religious policies passed by Aurangzeb. And then also we're going to see there's a lot of conflict in the collapse of the Mughal dynasty, and they're going to be coming into conflict with both the British Empire, who has established itself in the coastal regions of India and are now pushing inwards to the Deccan and into northern territories that are controlled by the Mughals. And then there's also the growth of the Marathan Empire, which is an indigenous Indian empire that will rise up in response to Aurangzeb's restrictive religious policies. So when you put the fact that the Marathas are pushing from the interior against the Mughals, and that you also have the British pushing from the coast, this is just too much pressure for the Mughals to live with, and they will ultimately collapse inward on themselves. But really what we should be taking away from this is that no process of empire building ever goes uncontested. The Mughals are ultimately going to be collapsing underweight from internal schisms as well as external influences. So that's our first case study for this week. The other one that I'm going to briefly touch on is the growth and fall of the Oyo state in West Africa, the Oyo Empire. This empire was founded, as best we can tell, somewhere around 1400, so the very beginning of the 15th century. And they are going to, almost as soon as they come about on the picture there in terms of power in the region of West Africa, and we're talking about really the area that today we would call southwestern Nigeria, and it spreads over into Benin and Togo as well. But that's where they're going to be growing out of. They're basically forming a centralized hierarchical state, and that's different from what's growing out around them. They're taking sort of a cue from the northern Muslim states that are established in northern Nigeria. They are using centralized top-down hierarchies, and this just makes ruling an empire so much easier. You cannot have little local rulers fighting over fiefdoms and small bits of territory, and if that's going on within your empire, you don't have effective control over it. So having that hierarchical top-down power structure is really a necessity of empire building. And that's what we're seeing growing out with the Oyo as well. They are distinguished from their neighbors in the forested regions of southwestern Nigeria in that they are centralized, and that's going to allow them to expand outwards. Now, as I said, almost as quickly as they come to power in this region, they're invaded by a group of people called the Nupe. The Nupe have ties to the Islamic world through the Saharan trade routes, and they're going to use cavalry to drive the Oyo out of their city centers, in particular a place called Oyo Ife, Oyo Ile, or sometimes it's called Ile Ife. They established this area as a religious center, and they're going to use religious hegemony as a means of consolidating the area around them. People will start to convert as they get more powerful. They look at the Yoruba or the Oyo deity that's existing in Oyo Ile, and they're going to be traveling from long distances to worship this particular deity, and that's going to bring them informally into the sphere of influence of the Oyo. But they're kicked out by the Nupe, and the ruling class is going to be gone for about 50 to 70 years, living in the northern Nigerian state of Borgu. But when they're in Borgu, they have a lot of close connections with Fulani people who had spread all across West Africa using horsemen and cavalry as a means of military expansion. So they start to reconsolidate their political structure, and they reconstitute their military structure using a cavalry. From there, they're going to reinvade Oyo Ile, Ilife, whatever you choose to call it, and that's that religious center that they'd originally set up, and they reestablish their ruling class, which is seen by way of their kings called Alifins. So from there, they're going to start to grow by leaps and bounds throughout the 1500s, and that's because they have critical connections not just to Saharan trade routes, but also to Atlantic trade routes at the coast. And this becomes even more pointed in 1728 when we see a war break out between the neighboring Dahomey people, another major slave trading state. They had grown off the back of the Atlantic slave trade in West Africa, doing business with European trade partners. But when the Oyo Empire comes into conflict with the Dahomey, they're ultimately going to conquer them and grab all of the coastal ports through which they're trading slaves. So this is going to make the Oyo so much stronger and so much more powerful. So you can see that they're taking advantage of a lot of changing circumstances in this area of West Africa to grow an expansive empire. And so ultimately, the Oyo are going to start to collapse, as best we can tell, sometime around the late 1700s. What happens is there's a lot of people inside their royal court have become corrupt and start seeking power for themselves, even though they're not legitimately part of the royal class. And so there's a series of Alphans or kings of the Oyo who are forced to commit ceremonial suicide, and that is going to leave a power vacuum at the top of the Oyo Empire. In particular, there's a guy named Gafa, and Gafa is the one who's going around forcing these Alphans to commit suicide because he's publicly bringing a lot of their secrets out and shaming them, basically, to the point where, by way of their duty, they're forced to commit ceremonial suicide. And then they, obviously, once dead, they're not going to be ruling the kingdom anymore. So we're left with this power vacuum, and that creates an opportunity for other kingdoms that are starting to become more powerful in that region. In particular, the newly established Sokoto Caliphate of northern Nigeria is going to use an equally powerful cavalry to take advantage of the weakness of the Oyo, and they'll start raiding in from the north and making the state shrink its actual physical boundaries. And then ultimately, with the establishment of the Lagos colony by the British in the 1800s, we're going to see that the Alphans of Oyo become simply ceremonial rulers of the area, and they stop having actual political power in the region. And so really what we're seeing here is that whether you're in Asia, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in the Americas, or you're in Africa, people are looking at changing circumstances using centralized hierarchical sort of power structures to expand and take advantage of weaker decentralized neighbors. And so again, the whole purpose of this lecture is to get people thinking in more globally, not so bound to the Atlantic world geographically. We have to understand that it is not just Europe who's building empires during this time period, but also African and Asian empires are growing and taking advantage of an increasingly globalized trade network during this time period. Well, that just about wraps up everything I have to say this week. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to email me. Take care.